The stagecoach wheels churned dust into the scorching Arizona air as it rolled into Riverside, a settlement that clung to the banks of the Colorado River like a stubborn burr to a saddle blanket. Tansy Valenti clutched her worn leather satchel against her chest, her knuckles white with anticipation and fear. The year was 1878, and Riverside, despite its promising name, looked every bit as unforgiving as the desert that surrounded it. "End of the line, miss," the driver called, not bothering to help her down from the coach. Tansy gathered her skirts and descended carefully, her boots landing with a soft thud on Arizona soil. She had traveled over 2,000 miles from Boston with nothing but her satchel, a small trunk of belongings, and a skill that had been deemed frivolous by her late father, and unbecoming by the society she'd left behind. The main street of Riverside stretched before her, a dusty thoroughfare lined with wooden storefronts, a saloon, and what appeared to be a general store. Men in worn hats and dustier boots lounged in whatever shade they could find, their eyes following her with undisguised curiosity. Tansy squared her shoulders. 25 years of life had taught her that appearances mattered, especially first ones. She smoothed her travel-wrinkled skirt, adjusted her hat, and strode toward what appeared to be a boarding house at the end of the street. The sign above the door read, "Mrs. Palmer's Lodging," in faded paint. Tansy knocked, and moments later found herself facing a stout woman with iron-gray hair and a surprisingly kind face. "I need a room," Tansy said, extending what she hoped was a respectable amount of money, and information about employment opportunities in Riverside. Mrs. Palmer counted the bills, tucked them into her apron pocket, and gave Tansy an appraising look. "Rooms are upstairs. What kind of work are you looking for, miss?" "Valenti. Tansy Valenti, and I'm a botanist. I specialize in medicinal plants and their applications." Mrs. Palmer's eyebrows rose. "A what now?" "A botanist. I study plants, medicinal ones mostly." A flicker of disappointment crossed the woman's face. "Well, Miss Valenti, I don't know what call there'd be for that sort of thing here. Riverside needs seamstresses, laundresses, maybe a school teacher, but plant studying," she shook her head. "This is cattle country, dear." Tansy felt her heart sink but kept her expression neutral. "I see. Well, I'm sure I can find something suitable. Is there a doctor in town?" "Perhaps he could use my expertise." Mrs. Palmer led her up a narrow staircase. "Doc Miller comes through once a month from Yuma. Otherwise, folks here mostly rely on Mrs. Holloway's remedies or just suffer through whatever ails them." She pushed open a door to reveal a small but clean room with a narrow bed and a washstand. "Here you are. Supper's at 6. Left alone, Tansy placed her satchel on the bed and moved to the window. The sun was beginning its descent, bathing the town in golden light that did little to soften its rough edges. She had come west with such hope that her knowledge would be valued here in a way it never had been back east. That she could build something for herself, away from the whispers and pitying looks that had followed her after her father's death. But Mrs. Palmer's reaction suggested Riverside might not be the fresh start she'd envisioned. The next morning, Tansy set out to explore the town and inquire about work. The general store owner, Mr. Jenkins, listened politely to her qualifications before informing her that he had no need for a botanist but could use someone to sweep the floors and stock shelves. The saloon owner made an offer that turned her cheeks crimson. The owner of the small hotel suggested she might work as a maid. By midday, her hope had withered like a delicate bloom in the desert sun. She sat on a bench outside the general store, watching the townspeople go about their business and wondering if she should have just stayed in Boston and married Mr. Caldwell, as her aunt had urged. A commotion down the street caught her attention. A horse had reared up, throwing its rider into the dust. The animal, clearly spooked by something, pranced nervously in circles as townsfolk scattered to avoid its flailing hooves. Without thinking, Tansy rushed forward. "Hold the reins," she called to a bewildered onlooker. The man grabbed the leather straps while Tansy approached the horse slowly, talking in a calm, steady voice. "It's all right," she said, reaching into her pocket for the sprig of lavender she always carried. She held it beneath the horse's nostrils, and almost immediately the animal began to calm. "That's it. Easy now." She stroked the horse's neck, continuing to murmur soothingly until its breathing steadied and its eyes lost their wild look. "Where'd you learn to do that?" a deep voice asked. Tansy turned to find a tall man watching her. He was perhaps 30, with sun-browned skin and eyes the color of a stormy sky. His clothes marked him as a ranch hand or cowboy practical, well-worn and covered with the dust of the trail. "Certain plants have calming properties," she explained, holding up the dried lavender. "Not just for humans." The man tilted his head, studying her with unexpected intensity. "You're new in town." "Yes. Tansy Valenti. I arrived yesterday." He nodded, a slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Xavier MacIntyre. Most folks call me Zav." He gestured to the horse, which now stood placidly beside them. "That was impressive, Miss Valenti." Tansy felt warmth rise in her cheeks that had nothing to do with the Arizona sun. "Thank you, Mr. MacIntyre." "That's my horse you just saved from running all the way to Mexico," said the man who had been thrown, now dusting himself off with more irritation than injury. "What spooked him like that?" Xavier MacIntyre glanced around, then pointed to a coiled rattlesnake near a water trough. "That'd be my guess." The townspeople murmured and backed away. Xavier calmly drew his pistol and dispatched the snake with a single shot. The crack of the gunshot made Tansy jump, her heart racing at the sudden violence. "Dangerous creatures," Xavier said, holstering his weapon, "but necessary. They keep the rabbit population in check." He turned to Tansy. "You know about plants. Do you know about animals too, Miss Valenti?" "Some," she admitted. "I've studied how various species interact with their environments." Something in his expression shifted interest, perhaps, or curiosity. "Interesting. I manage the Double M Ranch just outside of town. We've been having some trouble with our cattle getting sick. The usual remedies aren't working." Tansy's pulse quickened. "What are their symptoms?" "Weakness, loss of appetite. Some of them develop sores around their mouths." He hesitated. "I know it's not exactly proper to ask, but would you be willing to come out to the ranch and take a look? My boss, Mr. Miller, is at his wit's end." Here was an opportunity, perhaps not what she'd envisioned, but an opportunity nonetheless. "I'd be happy to, Mr. MacIntyre." "Tomorrow morning. I can send a wagon for you." "That would be fine." As Xavier tipped his hat and led both horses away, Tansy felt a flutter of something she hadn't experienced since leaving Boston, a sense of purpose, and the faint stirring of possibility. The wagon arrived promptly at 9 the next morning. Tansy had risen early, packing her satchel with the tools of her trade, a small microscope, several journals containing her notes on plant species and their properties, a collection of dried specimens, and the few remedies she'd managed to create from local plants during her journey west. Xavier MacIntyre himself drove the wagon, his greeting warm but respectful. As they left Riverside behind, the landscape opened up into vast expanses of scrubland dotted with saguaro cacti and mesquite trees. Mountains loomed in the distance, their jagged profiles stark against the clear blue sky. "It's beautiful," Tansy said, breathing in the scent of sage and sun-warmed earth. Xavier glanced at her, surprise evident in his expression. "Most Easterners find it too harsh." "It is harsh," she agreed, but honest. Everything here has adapted to survive thorns, thick bark, deep roots. There's something admirable in that. His smile reached his eyes this time. That's a good way of looking at it. The Double M Ranch came into view after an hour's journey, a sprawling compound of low adobe buildings, corrals, and outbuildings. Men on horseback herded cattle in the distance, dust clouds marking their progress across the range. "How many cattle does the ranch run?" Tansy asked as Xavier helped her down from the wagon. "About 2,000 head. Mr. Miller, Matthew Miller, started with just 50 when he came here 15 years ago. Built it all up from nothing." There was respect in Xavier's voice. "He's a good man to work for, tough but fair." He led her to a corral where several cattle had been separated from the herd. Even to Tansy's untrained eye, they looked unwell, listless, with dull coats and visible sores around their muzzles. A heavy-set man with a salt and pepper beard approached, his expression wary. "This the plant lady you told me about, MacIntyre?" "Yes, sir. Mr. Miller, this is Miss Tansy Valenti." "Miss Valenti, Matthew Miller." Tansy extended her hand. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Mr. Miller." Miller ignored her hand, instead gesturing to the sick cattle. "Can you help them or not? I've lost 12 head already and can't afford to lose more." Tansy withdrew her hand, determined not to show her discomfort at his rudeness. "I'll need to examine them and the areas where they've been grazing. The sickness could be coming from something they're eating." Miller snorted. "They eat grass, same as they always have." "Not always," Xavier interjected. "Remember those new pastures we opened up along the East Ridge last month? That's when the sickness started." Tansy nodded. "I'll need to see those pastures." Miller looked like he wanted to object, but finally shrugged. "Fine. MacIntyre, take her wherever she needs to go, but I want results, not just talk about plants and such." He stalked away without waiting for a response. "I apologize for Mr. Miller," Xavier said quietly. "He's worried about his herd." "No need to apologize. I understand his concern." Tansy knelt beside the nearest cow, examining the sores around its mouth. "These look like chemical burns. Has anything been sprayed on the new pastures?" "No, madam. We don't use sprays of any kind." Tansy stood, brushing dust from her skirt. "Then let's look at those pastures." Xavier saddled 2 horses, and soon they were riding toward the eastern edge of the ranch property. Tansy, who had learned to ride in Boston's public gardens, found herself grateful for those lessons as she urged her mount up a steep incline. The new pastures spread before them, lush with what appeared to be healthy grazing land. Tansy dismounted and began to walk slowly through the grass, her eyes scanning the ground. Xavier watched her, curious but silent. After 20 minutes of methodical searching, she stopped and knelt to examine a cluster of plants. "Here," she said, pointing to a delicate white flower. "This is white snakeroot. It's highly toxic to cattle and to humans who consume milk or meat from affected animals." Xavier crouched beside her, his arm brushing against hers as he leaned in to see the plant. The brief contact sent an unexpected warmth through her. "I've never noticed it before. It's not native to this region. It must have been introduced somehow, perhaps in feed brought from back east." Tansy carefully collected several specimens, placing them in her satchel. "The good news is we can clear it from the pastures." "How?" "It needs to be pulled up by the roots and burned. Every plant across all the affected areas." She glanced at him. "It will be labor-intensive." Xavier stood, offering his hand to help her up. His grip was strong, his palm calloused from years of ranch work. "We have the manpower. I'll organize the men as soon as we get back." True to his word, Xavier had a team of ranch hands working by late afternoon. Tansy showed them how to identify the white snakeroot and ensure they removed it completely. Meanwhile, She prepared a remedy for the affected cattle, a mixture of activated charcoal, which she had in her supplies, and local clay, which would help absorb the toxins. As the sun began to set, painting the western sky in brilliant oranges and pinks, Xavier found her administering the remedy to the last of the sick cattle. "The men have cleared about a quarter of the east pasture already," he reported. "They'll continue at first light tomorrow." "Good. The cattle should start showing improvement within a day or two, as long as they don't consume any more of the plant." Xavier leaned against the corral fence, watching her work. "Where did you learn all this, Miss Valenti?" Tansy wiped her hands on a cloth and joined him at the fence. "My father was a professor of natural sciences at Harvard. I grew up surrounded by his books and specimens." She smiled at the memory. "While other girls had dolls, I had a microscope and a collection of pressed flowers." "And your father taught you?" Her smile faded. "No, he believed women lacked the intellectual capacity for scientific study. I taught myself, in secret at first. Later, I assisted one of his colleagues who didn't share his views." She looked out over the ranch, not wanting to see pity in Xavier's eyes. "When my father died last year, I decided it was time to make my own way." "That took courage," Xavier said quietly. "Or foolishness," Tansy replied with a rueful laugh. "No one in Riverside seems interested in my botanical knowledge." "I was." His voice was soft, sincere. "And Mr. Miller will be too, once his cattle recover." Their eyes met, and something passed between them, a moment of understanding, perhaps, or recognition of a kindred spirit. The moment was broken by the dinner bell ringing from the main house. Xavier straightened. "Mr. Miller has invited you to dine with us. It's the least he can do for your help today." Dinner was a surprisingly pleasant affair. Matthew Miller, while still gruff, showed grudging respect for Tansy's diagnosis and treatment plan. The cook had prepared a hearty meal of beef stew, fresh bread, and apple pie, which they ate at a long table in the ranch house dining room. "If your remedy works, Miss Valenti," Miller said as he cut into his pie, "I'd be interested in keeping you on as a consultant." "Can't afford to lose any more cattle." Tansy nearly choked on her water. "A consultant?" "Yes. Come out once a week or so, check the herd, identify any troublesome plants. I'd pay you fair wages." He glanced at Xavier. "MacIntyre here says you're having trouble finding suitable employment in town." "That's very kind of you, Mr. Miller. I would be happy to accept your offer." Xavier caught her eye across the table, a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. She felt a flutter in her chest that had nothing to do with her new employment prospects. After dinner, Xavier drove her back to Riverside in the wagon, the journey made in comfortable conversation beneath a canopy of stars. When they reached Mrs. Palmer's boarding house, he helped her down, his hands lingering at her waist perhaps a moment longer than necessary. "Thank you for today, Miss Valenti," he said. "You may have saved the Double M Ranch." "I only applied what I know," she replied, suddenly shy under his intense gaze. "And please call me Tansy." "Tansy," he smiled. "I'll come for you next Tuesday then." "For your first day as the Double MTKS botanical consultant. I look forward to it. Xav." He tipped his hat and climbed back into the wagon. Tansy watched until he disappeared around the corner, a strange mixture of excitement and contentment settling over her. For the first time since arriving in Riverside, she felt like she might have found her place. The next few weeks established a pleasant routine. Every Tuesday, Xavier would arrive with the wagon to take Tansy to the Double M Ranch. She would spend the day examining the cattle, which were improving steadily, and surveying the pastures for any potentially harmful plants. She created detailed maps of the ranch's vegetation, marking areas where dangerous species grew and recommending alternative grazing routes. Matthew Miller, impressed by her thorough work and the recovery of his herd, increased her pay and began introducing her to other ranchers in the area. Soon, Tansy found herself with a growing list of clients, all eager to protect their livestock from botanical threats they'd never before considered. But it was her Tuesdays with Xavier that she treasured most. Their conversations ranged from the practical aspects of ranching to philosophical discussions about nature's balance to personal stories of their lives before Riverside. Xavier told her of growing up on a small farm in Colorado, losing his parents to influenza when he was 17, and making his way south to Arizona in search of work. Tansy shared memories of Boston, her secret studies, and her dreams of someday publishing her research on medicinal plants of the American West. "You should do it," Xavier said one Tuesday as they rode along the western boundary of the ranch. "Write that book," Tansy laughed. "Who would publish it?" "A botanical treatise by a woman with no formal education or scientific credentials." "Times are changing," Xavier replied. "Look at what you've accomplished here already. 3 months ago, no one in Riverside valued your knowledge. Now you have ranchers lining up for your advice." It was true. Her reputation had grown, and with it, a modest but steady income that allowed her to move from Mrs. Palmer's boarding house to a small cottage on the edge of town. She had transformed the cottage's tiny yard into an experimental garden, growing various medicinal plants and carefully documenting their properties. As summer gave way to fall, Tansy's work took her to ranches farther from town, sometimes requiring overnight stays. Xavier often accompanied her on these longer journeys, ostensibly to provide protection and assistance, though they both knew his presence was no longer strictly necessary. There was something growing between them, something neither had put into words yet, but that manifested in lingering glances, conversations that stretched late into the night, and an increasing awareness of each other's proximity. One crisp October evening, they were returning from a 3-day trip to a ranch near the New Mexico border when a sudden thunderstorm forced them to seek shelter in an abandoned line shack. The small, one-room structure was dusty but sound, with a stone fireplace and enough wood stacked beside it to last the night. Xavier built a fire while Tansy spread their bedrolls on opposite sides of the room, propriety maintained despite their isolated situation. As rain lashed against the small windows and thunder rumbled overhead, they shared a simple meal of jerky, dried fruit, and coffee. "I never thought I'd end up here," Tansy said, watching the flames dance in the fireplace. "When I left Boston, I had such grand plans. A position at a university out west, perhaps, or work with a scientific expedition." Xavier added wood to the fire. "Are you disappointed with how things turned out?" Tansy considered the question, drawing her knees up to her chest and wrapping her arms around them. "No," she said finally. "My work here matters. I'm using my knowledge to help people and animals. That's more than I could do in Boston, where no one would even listen to what I had to say." "You've changed Riverside," Xavier said quietly, "made it better. The town has changed me too." She looked at him across the fireplace, his features illuminated by the golden glow of the flames. "And you, Xavier MacIntyre, have changed me most of all." The confession hung in the air between them, more intimate than any words they'd yet shared. Xavier's expression softened and he moved to sit beside her. "Tansy," he began, his voice low, "I've never met anyone like you. Your determination, your intelligence, your way of seeing the world." He reached for her hand, his calloused fingers entwining with hers. "I find myself thinking about you even when you're not there, wondering what you'd notice about a particular plant or what you'd say about the sunset." Tansy's heart pounded so loudly she was certain he must hear it over the rain. "I think about you too," she whispered. His free hand came up to cup her cheek, his touch gentle as if she were one of her delicate specimens. "May I kiss you, Tansy Valenti?" In response, she leaned forward, closing the distance between them. His lips met hers, tentative at first, then with growing confidence as she responded to his touch. The kiss deepened, speaking of longing held in check for months, of affection that had grown steadily like one of Tansy's cultivated plants, nurtured by shared experiences and mutual respect. When they finally drew apart, Xavier rested his forehead against hers, his breathing uneven. "I've wanted to do that since the day you calmed that spooked horse in town." Tansy laughed softly. That long," he confirmed, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "I knew then you were something special. A woman who understood things others didn't see." They talked long into the night, the storm raging outside while they remained safe and warm by the fire, their hands rarely separating, their conversation interspersed with kisses that grew increasingly passionate. But when Tansy eventually fell asleep, it was in her own bedroll, Xavier's coat draped over her for extra warmth, his promise to be a gentleman honored despite the desire that burned between them. Morning brought clear skies and a changed relationship. They returned to Riverside with a new awareness of each other, their feelings acknowledged if not yet fully defined. Over the following weeks, Xavier began calling on Tansy at her cottage in the evenings, sometimes bringing small gifts, a rare plant he'd discovered on the range, a book of botanical illustrations he'd ordered from Tucson, once even a kitten he'd rescued from a coyote. The town noticed their courtship, of course. Mrs. Palmer clucked approvingly when Xavier escorted Tansy to church on Sundays. Mr. Jenkins at the general store began setting aside items he thought might interest the botanist and her cowboy. Even Matthew Miller seemed pleased by the development, gruffly telling Xavier he'd finally shown some sense in choosing that plant lady. As Christmas approached, Tansy found herself happier than she'd ever been. Her botanical consulting business was thriving. She now advised not only ranchers, but also the town's new doctor, who had arrived in November and immediately recognized the value of her knowledge of medicinal plants. She had begun writing her book on Western flora, encouraged by Xavier's unwavering belief in her abilities. And most precious of all, she had found love with a man who valued her mind as much as her heart. On Christmas Eve, Xavier invited her to dinner at Riverside's small hotel, which had decorated its dining room with pine boughs and candles for the holiday. Tansy wore her best dress, a deep green wool that brought out the auburn highlights in her chestnut hair, and a cameo necklace that had been her mother's. Xavier was waiting for her in the hotel lobby, looking uncharacteristically nervous in a clean suit, his usually wind-tousled hair neatly combed. His face lit up when she entered and he crossed to her in quick strides. "You look beautiful," he said, taking her hand and raising it to his lips. "And you look very handsome," she replied, smoothing his lapel. "Is something wrong? You seem tense." "Not wrong," he assured her, leading her into the dining room. "Just important." Their table was set apart from the others, with a small vase of winter berries and greenery as a centerpiece. They enjoyed a dinner of roast beef, potatoes, and apple pie, their conversation flowing easily as always. But Tansy noticed Xavier checking his pockets several times, his usual self-assurance tinged with an endearing nervousness. After their dessert plates had been cleared away, Xavier reached across the table for her hands. "Tansy," he began, "when you arrived in Riverside 9 months ago, this town didn't know what to make of you. A woman botanist, what use could that possibly be in cattle country?" Tansy smiled at the memory of those early difficult days. "But I saw something in you right away," Xavier continued. Not just your knowledge of plants, impressive as that is. I saw your courage, your determination, your willingness to forge your own path, regardless of what others thought. He stood and came around to her side of the table, then dropped to one knee beside her chair. A murmur ran through the dining room as other patrons noticed what was happening. Tansy Valenti, Xavier said, his voice steady despite the emotion evident in his eyes. You arrived in Riverside with skills no one valued. But I saw what they missed, not just a botanist, but a brilliant, beautiful, brave woman who has brought more joy into my life than I ever thought possible. He withdrew a small box from his pocket and opened it to reveal a simple but elegant ring with a small pearl surrounded by tiny diamonds. Will you do me the extraordinary honor of becoming my wife? Tears welled in Tansy's eyes. She had come west seeking professional recognition, never imagining she would find personal happiness as well. Yet here was this remarkable man who had seen her value from the beginning, offering her his heart and his future. Yes, she whispered, then louder. Yes, Xavier MacIntyre, I will marry you. The dining room erupted in applause as Xavier slipped the ring onto her finger and rose to kiss her. A kiss full of promise and love and shared dreams. When they finally broke apart, the hotel owner appeared with champagne for them and all the other diners, raising a toast to Riverside's botanist and her cowboy. Later, as they walked through the town under a canopy of stars, their breath visible in the cold night air, Xavier told her about his plans for their future. I've been saving my wages, he said, his arm around her waist. I want us to have our own place. Not just a cottage in town, but land room for your garden experiments, for raising cattle, for building something together. That sounds wonderful, Tansy said, leaning into his warmth. But where? Suitable land around here isn't cheap. Xavier smiled mysteriously. I have something to show you tomorrow. Consider it a Christmas present. Christmas morning dawned clear and cold. After exchanging gifts at Tansy's cottage, she had given him a hand-tooled leather journal for recording ranch observations. He had given her a beautiful brass microscope. Xavier hitched up his wagon for what he called the real present. They drove north of town for about an hour, leaving the main road to follow a winding track that led toward the mountains. Finally, they crested a rise, and Xavier drew the horses to a halt. Before them stretched a small valley, sheltered by hills on three sides and watered by a stream that glinted silver in the winter sunlight. A modest cabin stood near the stream, smoke rising from its chimney. What is this place? Tansy asked, taking in the stunning vista. It's ours, Xavier said simply. Or it can be. I've been negotiating with the owner, an old trapper who's moving to California to live with his daughter, 160 acres including water rights. The cabin needs work, but it's solid. Tansy stared at him in disbelief. You bought this? I made a down payment. Mr. Miller is lending me the rest, says it's an investment in keeping his cattle healthy, having you nearby. Xavier took her gloved hands in his. What do you think, Tansy? Could you be happy here? It's further from town than your cottage, but you'd have room for the largest botanical garden in Arizona territory. Tansy looked again at the valley, at the diverse vegetation visible even in winter, at the protected position that would allow for growing plants that couldn't survive in the open desert, at the sweet little cabin that could become their home. It's perfect, she said, her voice thick with emotion. Absolutely perfect. They spent the day exploring their future home, Xavier pointing out where they could expand the cabin, build a barn, plant an orchard. Tansy identified at least a dozen plant species of medicinal value growing wild on the property, her excitement building with each discovery. The previous occupant had left a few pieces of furniture in the cabin, including a table and chairs. Before they left, Xavier built a fire in the hearth, and they sat together planning their future as shadows lengthened across their land. "When shall we marry?" Xavier asked, his arm around her shoulders. "Spring," Tansy suggested. "When the wildflowers bloom, we could have the ceremony right here." "I like that idea." He kissed her temple. "What about your book? Will you still write it?" "Yes, with even more conviction now. This land will be my laboratory, my place to study and document the flora of the Southwest." She looked up at him. "And you'll help me. You already have an eye for plants most cowboys would overlook. I've had a good teacher." His smile was tender. "And I expect to keep learning from you for many years to come." They were married on the first day of May, 1879, beneath a canopy of mesquite trees in full bloom on their land. The entire population of Riverside attended, along with ranchers and their families from miles around. Tansy wore a simple white dress adorned with embroidered desert flowers, her hair crowned with a wreath of spring blossoms. Xavier, resplendent in a new suit, couldn't take his eyes off her as she walked toward him on Matthew Miller's arm, the older man having gruffly offered to give her away in the absence of her own father. The celebration lasted well into the evening, with tables set up near the cabin laden with food contributed by every family in attendance. There was music from a fiddler who lived on a neighboring ranch, dancing under the stars, and more goodwill than Tansy had ever experienced in formal Boston society. As night fell and the last guests departed, Xavier carried his bride across the threshold of their cabin, no longer the rough trapper's dwelling it had been, but a comfortable home they had spent months preparing together. They had added a bedroom, expanded the main living area, and built shelves for Tansy's growing collection of botanical specimens and scientific books. "Welcome home, Mrs. MacIntyre," Xavier said, setting her gently on her feet in the main room where a fire crackled welcomingly in the stone hearth. "I like the sound of that," Tansy replied, reaching up to loosen his tie, "though I may still use Valenti for my scientific publications." "As you should," he agreed, bending to kiss her. "I fell in love with Tansy Valenti, botanical genius. I wouldn't want her to disappear." Their kiss deepened, months of restraint finally giving way to the passion they had held in check until they were properly wed. Xavier's hands moved to the buttons at the back of her dress, his touch both reverent and eager. Tansy responded with equal fervor, her fingers working at the buttons of his shirt, their breathing quickening as barriers of fabric gave way to the warmth of skin against skin. That night, they learned each other in new ways, no longer just minds meeting in intellectual connection, but bodies discovering the joys of physical union. Xavier was a gentle lover, attentive to her inexperience yet ardent in his desire. Tansy, who had approached every aspect of life with curiosity and enthusiasm, brought the same qualities to their marriage bed, her initial shyness giving way to wonder and delight at the pleasures they found together. Afterward, lying in each other's arms as moonlight filtered through the curtains of their bedroom window, Xavier traced lazy patterns on her bare shoulder. "Happy, Mrs. MacIntyre." Tansy nestled closer against his chest, listening to the strong, steady beat of his heart. "Completely." "And you, Mr. MacIntyre." "More than I ever thought possible." He pressed a kiss to her forehead. "Who would have thought that a spooked horse and a sprig of lavender would lead to this? Providence works in mysterious ways," Tansy murmured sleepily. "Like plants that appear to be weeds but turn out to have the most remarkable properties." "Are you calling me a weed?" Xavier asked, amusement in his voice. "The most remarkable one I've ever found," she assured him, drifting off to sleep in the arms of the man who had seen her value when no one else had. The years that followed were ones of growth and prosperity for the MacIntyres. Their ranch, which they named Lavender Hill in honor of their first meeting, became known throughout Arizona territory for its innovative approach to cattle raising. Xavier's practical knowledge of ranching, combined with Tansy's scientific understanding of vegetation and animal health, created an operation that thrived even during the drought years that plagued many of their neighbors. Tansy's botanical garden expanded each season, eventually covering nearly 2 acres adjacent to their home. She cultivated medicinal plants from seeds and cuttings gathered during expeditions throughout the Southwest, meticulously documenting their properties and uses. Her reputation grew beyond Riverside, and physicians from as far away as San Francisco consulted her about treatments for various ailments. In 1882, 3 years after their wedding, the University of California Press published Medicinal Flora of the American Southwest by T.V. MacIntyre, the first comprehensive study of its kind. The book established Tansy as a respected authority in the field of botanical medicine, even among those who initially balked at accepting research conducted by a woman. That same year brought another blessing: the birth of their first child, a son they named James Miller MacIntyre, honoring both Tansy's father James and their friend and mentor Matthew Miller. Jamie, as they called him, grew into a sturdy, curious boy with his father's storm-gray eyes and his mother's love of exploration. 2 more children followed: Elizabeth in 1884 and Samuel in 1886, completing their family. The MacIntyre children grew up surrounded by nature, learning both the practical skills of ranching from their father and the wonders of the natural world from their mother. All 3 developed a deep respect for the land and its bounty, though it was Elizabeth who showed the most interest in Tansy's botanical work, often accompanying her mother on specimen-gathering expeditions by the time she was 7 years old. Riverside grew alongside the MacIntyre family, evolving from a rough frontier settlement into a prosperous small town with a school, a permanent doctor's office, and even a small library that proudly displayed Tansy's book on a special shelf for works by local authors. As the railroad reached Arizona territory, bringing more settlers and greater connectivity to the wider world, the town maintained its character while embracing progress. In 1889, 10 years after Tansy and Xavier's wedding, Lavender Hill Ranch hosted a celebration that brought together the entire community. The occasion was dual-purpose: the 10th anniversary of their marriage and the establishment of the Riverside Botanical Society, an educational organization founded with proceeds from Tansy's book and donations from grateful ranchers whose livestock had benefited from her knowledge over the years. The Society's mission was to document and preserve knowledge of the region's plant life, with particular emphasis on species of medicinal or agricultural importance. Its headquarters was a purpose-built structure on the MacIntyre property, equipped with microscopes, a small laboratory, and shelves for botanical specimens. Here, Tansy would train interested community members in basic plant identification and sustainable harvesting techniques, ensuring her knowledge would benefit future generations. The celebration was in full swing when Matthew Miller, now in his 60s with completely white hair but still robust, clinked a spoon against his glass to call for attention. 10 years ago, he began, his gruff voice carrying across the gathering, a stagecoach brought a young woman to Riverside who claimed to be a botanist. Most of us, myself included, didn't see much use for someone who studied plants in cattle country. Murmurs of agreement and chuckles rippled through the crowd. But Xavier MacIntyre saw something the rest of us missed. Miller gestured to where Xavier stood with his arm around Tansy's waist, their 3 children gathered around them. He saw a woman of exceptional intelligence and courage, with knowledge that would transform our community. Miller raised his glass higher. To Tansy and Xavier MacIntyre, who have shown us all that the most valuable skills are often the ones we don't recognize at first. And to the Riverside Botanical Society, which will ensure that the knowledge Tansy brought to our town continues to benefit our children and grandchildren. To the MacIntyres, the gathering echoed, glasses raised in toast. Later that evening, as the celebration wound down and their guests departed, Xavier and Tansy stood on the porch of their home, watching the last wagon disappear down the road that led to town. The children had been put to bed, exhausted from a day of play and celebration, and a peaceful quiet had settled over Lavender Hill Ranch. "Did you ever imagine this?" Tansy asked, leaning into her husband's embrace. "That day when I calmed your spooked horse, did you imagine we would be here like this 10 years later?" Xavier's arms tightened around her. "Not specifically this," he admitted, "but I knew my life had changed the moment I saw you with that sprig of lavender. I knew you were someone extraordinary. I was just a woman with unusual skills, trying to find my place in the world. You were a gift this town didn't deserve," Xavier countered, turning her to face him. At 40, he was still as handsome as the day they'd met, though his face now bore the lines of a decade of sun and wind and laughter. "And I thank God every day that I was the one who recognized what you had to offer." Tansy reached up to touch his face, her heart full of the same love that had grown steadily stronger through 10 years of marriage, 3 childbirths, droughts, successes, challenges, and everyday joys. "We recognized each other," she said softly. "2 people who didn't quite fit the expected mold, but who fit perfectly together." Their kiss was sweet with the familiarity of long love, yet still sparked with the passion that had never dimmed between them. As they stood together under an Arizona sky brilliant with stars, Tansy thought about the journey that had brought her here from a Boston society that had no place for a woman of science, to this land that had become more home than she could have ever imagined. She had arrived in Riverside with skills no one valued, until a cowboy saw what others missed. And in seeing her, truly seeing her, Xavier MacIntyre had helped her build not just a life or a career, but a legacy that would continue long after both of them were gone. As they walked hand in hand into their home, the future stretching before them as vast and promising as the western landscape they both loved, Tansy knew with absolute certainty that she had found exactly where she belonged. The years continued to be kind to the MacIntyres and their growing family. By the turn of the century, Lavender Hill Ranch had become one of the most prosperous in Arizona, known not just for its healthy cattle, but also for the botanical research conducted there. The Riverside Botanical Society, under Tansy's guidance, had grown into a respected institution, attracting students and researchers from universities across the country who came to study the desert flora and Tansy's innovative cultivation methods. Their children flourished as well. Jamie, now 18, had inherited his father's natural aptitude for ranching and was attending agricultural college in California, planning to bring new techniques back to Lavender Hill. Elizabeth, 16 and as intellectually curious as her mother, assisted Tansy with her research and had already co-authored a paper on desert plant adaptations that had been published in a scientific journal. Samuel, at 14, combined his father's practicality with his mother's scientific mind and showed promise as an engineer, constantly designing improvements for the ranch's irrigation systems and equipment. In 1904, 25 years after their wedding, Tansy and Xavier renewed their vows in the same spot where they had first married, though now the mesquite trees were larger, and the surrounding land showed the careful stewardship of a quarter-century of loving care. Their children stood beside them, Jamie tall and confident, Elizabeth radiant in a dress of her own design, Samuel fidgeting slightly in his Sunday best along with friends who had been part of their journey from the beginning. Matthew Miller, now in his 80s and reliant on a cane but still sharp-minded, once again gave Tansy away, his gruff exterior softened by the years of friendship. Mrs. Palmer, white-haired but still running her boarding house in town, dabbed at her eyes throughout the ceremony, remembering the uncertain young woman who had arrived in Riverside so many years ago. At 50, Tansy's chestnut hair was threaded with silver, and fine lines marked the corners of her eyes and mouth, evidence of a life filled with laughter and outdoor work. Xavier, at 55, moved a bit more carefully than in his younger days, the result of old ranch injuries that troubled him in cold weather, but his eyes still lit up whenever they fell on his wife. 25 years, he marveled as they danced under the stars after the ceremony, their guests enjoying the feast spread out on tables around them. It seems both a lifetime and the blink of an eye. The best kind of lifetime, Tansy replied, her head resting on his shoulder as they swayed to the music of a string quartet from Tucson, a far cry from the single fiddler at their original wedding. One so full of love and purpose that you don't notice the passage of time. Do you ever regret it? Xavier asked, coming west, choosing this life instead of pursuing recognition in more established scientific circles. Tansy leaned back to look into his eyes. Never, she said firmly. I've done more meaningful work here than I ever could have in a university. And I found you, which made everything else possible. The celebration continued into the night, a testament to the impact the MacIntyres had made on their community over 25 years. The Riverside Botanical Society had transformed how local ranchers managed their land, leading to more sustainable practices throughout the region. Tansy's research had influenced medical treatments far beyond Arizona, and her books, she had published 3 more since her first, were standard texts in schools of pharmacy and medicine nationwide. As midnight approached, Xavier led Tansy away from the festivities to a quiet spot on a hill overlooking their property. The ranch buildings, the expanded main house, the children's cottages, the botanical laboratory, the barns and corrals spread out below them, lanterns glowing warmly in the desert night. I have something for you, Xavier said, reaching into his pocket. A silver anniversary gift. He handed her a small velvet box. Inside was a pendant, a perfect replica of a lavender sprig crafted in silver and amethyst, suspended from a delicate chain. Oh, Xavier, Tansy breathed, touching the exquisite piece with gentle fingers. It's beautiful. To remind us how it all began, he said, taking the necklace and fastening it around her neck. With a woman who knew the power of plants and a man wise enough to recognize her value. Tansy's eyes filled with tears as she reached up to touch the pendant where it rested against her skin. I love you, Xavier MacIntyre, as much today as I did 25 years ago, no more, because now I know exactly how remarkable you are. And I love you, Tansy Valenti MacIntyre, he replied, using both her names as he always did on important occasions, acknowledging all aspects of who she was. My botanist, my partner, my heart. Their kiss was both a celebration of 25 years shared, and a promise of years still to come, years that would see their children marry and have families of their own. Years that would bring new discoveries in Tansy's laboratory and continued prosperity to their ranch. Years that would see Riverside grow into a substantial town where botanical knowledge was valued as highly as cattle raising. As they made their way back to the celebration, hand in hand under the vast Arizona sky, Tansy reflected on how far she had come from that uncertain day when she'd stepped off the stagecoach into a town that had no apparent place for her. She had found not just a place, but a purpose, not just acceptance, but appreciation, not just a husband, but a true partner who had seen her potential when no one else could. And in that, seeing that recognition of worth that others had missed, Xavier MacIntyre had helped her create something neither of them could have built alone. A legacy of knowledge, love, and respect that would continue to grow long after their time on Earth was done, as enduring as the desert plants they had both learned to cherish.